1, Episode 40 of the Potomac RPG Podcast. My, this story has all the twists and turns of a train ride through Nebraska.
Welcome one and all to the Potomac RPG Podcast, your source for old news, tired conversation, and mediocre advice for all of your favorite tabletop role-playing games. I'm your host and unavoidable NPC sidekick who never leaves the party, Adam.
And I'm your there's no way out except through these hungry guillotine-shaped mimics that will no doubt end in a TPK, Sarah.
And I'm your inevitable encounter that ends in defeat so that the narrative can force you down a particular path, Steve.
Oh, lovely to have both of you on the show. We had a great night last night in Tom's campaign. We saved a marriage in our session last night.
An ogre marriage, no less.
Yeah, ogre marriage between Nob and Thob.
Thog, it's Thog.
Thog, you're right. And they were having a bit of a dispute, and through a well-placed suggestion spell from Matt's character, they learned to work out their differences in their own unique ogre way. How'd you guys feel about last night's session?
Well, what was beautiful about the whole ogre situation is that there was still a combat going on around that. So here we are dicing up goblins all around these two ogres who are trying to talk through their marital problems. You know, Nob was very convinced through clever role play and persuasion rolls and then a suggestion spell that he really needed to work on his relationship with Thog and sort out the dynamics of respect, mutual respect between the two of them. Thog being the strong-willed, hit him over the head and make him do what she wants type. And
literally,
she wasn't as cooperative. I mean, she was still throwing some javelins at us while Nob was trying to, grapple her into their stalagmite secluded den of furs and God only knows what else. But that was one of the most clever uses of a spell and some role play that I've seen. Like it obviously took everyone kind of wanting to make it work a little bit in terms of the role play and not just sort of like, wow, let's just go straight into combat attack. It's just something else. You can't replicate that.
Yeah, and I think what was special about it is that we all were kind of invested in Nob's success. When by the time this happened, like the way Tom had played him, he'd become a little bit almost endearing. Like he was trying to work out some stuff with his dull mind, because we were trying to negotiate, and then to see that he was on the short end of the stick when it came to the marriage and wasn't being treated as an equal and all that. I think that was an injustice we all kind of wanted to see righted. So it was really well done.
Yeah, and good on Tom. I mean, as a DM, that's a difficult situation to navigate, and for him to not only allow the suggestion spell to take place the way that it did, and kind of work with that with regard to how Thog reacted to Nob's behavior. Yeah, that's not an easy thing to do, and I think he recognized where we were trying to make this go and found a way to logically have that happen. And it was a beautiful moment and a welcome break while we're fighting goblins to see this scene just kind of take place in the middle of this fierce fighting. Really cool scene. Good on you, Tom. Nice job last night. But let's get into what we're going to talk about for the day. There are few things more frustrating to a player than when you seem to be following the storyline that offers no choices and no way to alter its course. I am talking about, of course, the dreaded railroad. Now,
Choo-choo.
Railroading, so railroading is pretty far up the list on the horrible things to do to your player's compendium, and yet Reddit is filled with players and DMs running into it over and over again. So that's what the topic is going to be today: railroading, what it is, and how to make sure those tracks don't run through your game. Now, Sarah, there are a few ways to define railroading. What is railroading to you, and why is it so bad?
Railroading to me is when the DM has in mind a narrative path that the players need to take with their characters, and is not really budging at all away from that path, to the point that it's not allowing the characters to be creative or to maybe even find another way around the problem, or even just like be themselves. They have to respond in a certain way in order to trigger the event that's going to lead them through to the next level, or whatever it takes. And the reason that is so frustrating is, we come to the table because we want to explore these worlds and these characters. And if the decision's already made for us, then we're not really participating, other than, playing something out that's already been determined. And that's not fun. That's not role play. That's, we'll pick up a video game if we want something that's been predetermined with few choices. Here, it's so much richer when it feels like you get to embody that character in every way that you can, and make decisions and be creative and even outthink the bad guys. And so when that choice is taken from you, it just makes you feel useless at the table. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty obvious way to describe railroading. I mean, it's bad because the game's all about player choice, and if you're going to take away player choice, well, to your point, I might as well play a video game where, at least I can go at my own pace and try out the limited options that they have for me. But the beauty, what really, makes tabletop role playing shine is that ability to, do things that are unexpected, like say cast a suggestion spell to help ogres work out their marriage. I mean, a game programmer could be clever and go, I'm going to put that in my video game, but it's unlikely. And, if it did happen, that's like a once across an entire game and storyline that you're going to play. Well, this is something that, now can become, it was Matt's character who cast a suggestion spell, and maybe now it has all these impacts on Matt's character, maybe making them a little less racist against these sort of monstrous races. Maybe it's something that that she'll try again in another scenario, or she might not have otherwise. We may see these ogres show up again as NPCs at some point, or come back and check on the status of their marriage and just make sure everything's working out. Who knows? But all of that comes from the fact that there's this sort of freedom to choose, that doesn't need to be a life or death encounter that we have to either be killed by the ogres or kill the ogres. For example, we were able to find a creative way, and that's what makes the game fun. So you take that out and, put us on the tracks, and it just loses a lot of its joy.
Yeah, it really does. Now, Sarah, you had brought up a little earlier with regard to railroading, just in terms of whether we'd be talking about it from the DM side or the player side, and you brought up a good point about player railroading. And what is that to you? Like, how would you explain player railroading?
It's basically when a particular player in the group tends to run roughshod over every other player's ideas, or the characters. They usually tend to try and be, or they are the leader of the group, and they drown out other ideas in favor of their own, and they tend to probably want the DM's either attention more, or the clues more, because they want to be the one to solve it. There might be a lot of ego there. But it can be very, very frustrating when you have someone in your group who does not play well with others.
Yeah. Or like the one who has the background that already determines what their future is going to be. Like I'm the long lost whatever, and I'm going to become the ruler of the world by the end. Yeah. It's like, oh well, I guess we don't need to play then, do we?
Yeah, that's I mean, the first half of that can be cool, but the second half not so much. And I mean, we probably don't want to get too far down the road, but it can also be, a challenge. It's not so much railroading, but when you have players who do the opposite of what Sarah was just describing, and they kind of just wait around for someone else to drive the action, them. Because then you kind of, you push everything towards a railroad because, everything's so passive. So, I mean, it's really incumbent upon everyone to, make sure that they're as engaged as they can be in trying to help drive the narrative. And that's, my characters tend to be talkative because I'm talkative. And so that's one thing that I always try to be cognizant of when we're playing, is that, like, well, how much, quote, screen time has my character been soaking up? How much of the, narrative weight have I been sort of pushing around? And then try to make sure that I step back and let other people sort of slide into the role. as much as, makes sense. And, obviously I'm still trying to play my character. And if something's important to them, something's important to them. But, it's incumbent upon everyone to kind of strike that balance.
Absolutely. Good points, both of you. Well, let's dig into this topic a little bit more and get into some questions for the week. So the first post we have comes from Reddit user Sneak for Work Only, who asks, if you're not a sandbox campaign,
that's
you're
for work.
Snack. Yeah, well, but it means sneak. Okay.
No,
I think it means snake. Okay. It's like cutie
snake. Okay, fine. Snack for work only. Fine.
Ask them to tell us what it means.
Yes. Snake for work only, whatever you are.
Because if they wanted to be sneak, why wouldn't they just put an extra letter in? It's one letter. You know what I mean?
That's not cool. You have to leave the letter out for it to be cool. Come on, get with the times. All right. If you're not a sandbox campaign, you're a railroad campaign. Is there absolutely no middle ground between these two concepts? So basically, this person was quoting that as a quote. If you're not a sandbox campaign, you're a railroad campaign. So short and sweet here. Steve, what do you say to that statement? I mean, I think I know what you're going to say here, but is there a middle ground between a sandbox campaign and a railroad campaign?
I'm really curious. What is it you think I'm going to say?
I think you're going to say, of course there is. Like that. That's ridiculous.
No, definitely. Of course. And I'm not going to say it's ridiculous. I mean, because the way everyone talks about it is it sounds like, you start reading you mentioned all of these posts on Reddit and this and that, and you start reading it. And sometimes it gets this vibe where it's like if a DM doesn't just sit there and kind of go, okay, guys, I've prepared for every possible eventuality. What would you like to do now? And I want to run a tavern. And then the DM should run a tavern, or they're a bad DM, play a game about running a tavern, or they're a bad DM. That's one extreme, right? That's there's zero railroad here, except for the fact that I put you on, this world in this setting or something like that. Whereas, if you pick up, Curse of Strahd, Storm King's Thunder, Out of the Abyss, whatever, one of these pre-made modules, I mean, those can be fairly on the rails, which is, a term for railroading. And so there's got to be a middle ground. So I think back to my ongoing game in Avernus. Look, there's a story going on. I'm trying to tell this story about Elturel and Avernus and to some extent Baldur's Gate. And, that's the story I'm telling. So if you guys decided on a whim, well, we want to go take a trip to Tribor and go hunting, like I might be able to find a way to fit that in a little bit. But, it's not going to be the thrust of the campaign. And it's certainly not going to be something that isn't going to somehow find its way woven back into the main point of the campaign, right? So usually you go hunting in Tribor, and I don't know, there's elves in the woods, and you hunt things, and there's goblins, because it seems to be goblins are everywhere. Well, if you guys go hunting in Tribor, oh look, there's fiends, and what are they doing here? And there'll be some weird way I would tie that into the plot. And the point I'm trying to make is that DMs that want to tell a story, especially if you're running a module of some kind, it's the whole point of buying a module is to tell that story. It's okay to have a story in mind, and to a certain extent, people will view that as being, on a railroad. But what I think the point is to, listen to what your players are interested in, what they want to do, and communicate up front that here's the type of game I want to run for you guys, so that they, make characters that are, somewhat consistent with that. I'm a homebody who doesn't like to leave the house and would never go anywhere on any sort of adventures. Well, if you make that character, in a campaign, when that the adventure is going to drag you by the hair out of your home and on some crazy adventure, well, you can't really complain about being railroaded at that point. You've sort of asked for it, right? So it's about finding a balance. One thing, and I want to let Sarah cut in here and see what she has to say about this, but one thing I want to make a plug for is, you may have heard me mention before, probably not. I don't know if I've talked about it on the show, but it's this book called Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master by Sly Flourish.
Yeah.
And what he kind of points out is a great way to build sessions and scenarios without feeling like you have to. His point is really about like minimizing the DM's work, not so much not railroading players, though it works together. Is that he suggests you figure out like where's the session start. Here are some clues or information or plot beats that you want to have happen in the narrative, and maybe here's some secrets that could be discovered in the session. And then you sort of organically figure out where to drop those in as your players sort of respond to the situation around them. So it gives you this great way of letting the players sort of decide what they want to do, but you already know, like, okay, because I, as a DM, like, if I know I want you to run into an NPC, like, sure, I might have figured out that, like, well, they're in the throne room, they're the right hand of the king, and that's when you're going to meet them. But, like, I can find other ways for this person to be in different places, and my players aren't going to know that I did that. So it's not really railroading, but to a certain extent it kind of is, because I'm saying this encounter is going to happen one way or another. I'm just going to be willing to adapt the encounter to what my players are trying to do, rather than say, let me force you guys into the throne room so you meet my dude.
But don't you guys think that the length of time of your campaign has direct impact on whether or not you have the room to sandbox? Like, if it's a one-shot campaign that's only going to be for one night, or even like 2 nights, how much room do you have for people to kind of like explore? It's almost like you need to create the illusion of a sandbox, and provide a little bit of flexibility, but you won't have the same flexibility as we have with Avernus, where we can spend, half of a session, exploring the city and taverns until we stumble upon the one that we want.
No, that's a good point, and I think really what it comes down to is, and I saw a few responses to these kind of questions touch on this, and that's the social contract that you have. So, for example, with a one shot, there's a social contract amongst the group members that says, "Hey, we have one session, so there's going to be a drive or a force to go through this story and not kind of go off on these wild tangents that is going to suck up time." But the other side of that is I don't think it's necessarily that, like, there's a lot of confusion between plot and railroad. Like, just because there's a story doesn't mean it's a railroad. It's whether or not the choices that you make will affect it. So I don't even think it's a difference between a railroad and a sandbox. I mean, a sandbox is just kind of no direction, and I don't think having a plot or a story that you're following, that everyone recognizes, okay, this is the storyline, this is the beat that we're following. I don't necessarily think that's a railroad, because the choices that you make along that story are going to have effects down the road on that story. And that's what keeps it from being a railroad, that your choice has an effect. What do you think on that, Steve?
No, I think that you hit the nail on the head. I mean, if you're playing, like when Sarah was running her one shot, which turned into, I think, like 3 or 4 sessions, which is just totally indicative of our group and how we approach scenarios. But,
yes, it is.
There's an implicit setup. And I think that, our group thankfully doesn't really need to think a lot about this sort of push and pull. But, if you're signing up for that one shot to sit down and play, like, you kind of have to, buy into the setup that's being put out there, it's and sort of follow through on the action. But overall, railroading is not just, well, we have a plot, though sometimes folks will make it sound like that. And that, I go back to my example of, well, I've set up this intricate campaign with all of these plots going on, and my players, all they seem to want to do is sit here and run a tavern. So should I just abandon my plot? I mean, you can. I mean, if that's really, you're having fun with it and your players are having fun with it, that's fine. But your players probably shouldn't expect that, the game is all about running a tavern. Now, depending on what the plot is, it could be about running a tavern in that scenario, which could be fun. But it's all about that, working with each other, and there actually takes, players need to have there's an infinite number of possibilities that a person can think up to do in any scenario, but you've got to generally trend those towards we're playing a cooperative role-playing game and trying to tell a story together.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, when it comes to a sandbox campaign, I don't much care for a sandbox. I like sandbox in video games because, it's kind of that explorer aspect of video games. But within a tabletop game, I mean, you have only a certain amount of hours that you can devote to sitting around a table and playing, and you want your character to really matter, and to make your character matter, there has to be a story that you can build your character into. So these sandbox campaigns, I mean, everyone talks about how they want sandbox. Well, there's no direction in sandbox. You just say, okay, there's a hill over there, and I want to go.
That's not entirely true, right?
It is true.
I think no.
I said it's true, therefore it's true.
I disagree.
This is the way. with the way a good sandbox game works is that the players are coming in with characters who have motivations and ambitions
Missions,
and just drives and goals and
objectives.
missions. Exactly. It's not
Stakes.
like, hey, let's, because you still need a way to like bind the characters together so that they're in a group to some extent. So you're not just spending, I've got 5 players and I'm running 5 separate scenes all the time and jumping between those, right? So there's going to be some sort of plot hooks and narrative ideas, but they're coming in with their own desires. And it's really about players saying like, well, my character wants to become king, right? And he starts off as like a lowly, scrappy rogue. So he may not become king, but how does he do that? And maybe some of the other players have their own ambitions, and it's like, well, if you and I work together, we can kind of use each other to help achieve our own ends. And maybe they really are genuine about wanting to lift each other up, or maybe they're ready to, sell the other one out at the last second. You know what I mean? To secure their advantage and all that. And that's where the story basically becomes, what do the players, and with the DM involved, what sort of story do they want to tell, which is different from, hey guys, I bought Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. I've got a lot of things I'm going to tool around with in it, make it my own, and you guys can bring your own stuff to the table, but we're telling a story about Avernus. Versus the sandbox is like, well, this is kind of the story, and that can evolve. Maybe there's a plot point, and now my character doesn't want to become king anymore. He realizes that that's wrong, or maybe he thought he had a birthright that he doesn't, or there's something that happened in the game that makes him say, this is more important to me, and we now need to go on a crusade against the Order of the Dark Heart and free the people of whatever.
Well, I accept your definition of it, but I still personally, I don't know. What do you think, Sarah? Like, do you prefer a sandbox style more than a story driven, specific plot line? I know personally, I'd rather have some direction to kind of build off of rather than trying to come up with plot on my own and then following that through.
So I think the answer I'm going to give isn't going to be as satisfying as you want. For me, I want the illusion of a sandbox, meaning like I could go off and do anything I want.
Is what you want.
Well, no, I mean this is all like a shared hallucination. Let's face it. But I want the illusion of that sandbox, right? That the world is just big and I could explore anything that I wanted. I don't want to feel like I'm being herded. And it's something too that we have to watch out for too when we're writing like novels and stuff like that. You need to make sure that the reader, it doesn't feel like they're being herded to, or that the story is forced in any way. It has to feel natural. So if the characters have an objective that is meaningful to them, and then if you really want to make it extra fun, put a timer on it. They're gonna be motivated to take care of it and bump into people and do, ask the questions and interview people and all that, and just find out what they need to know to move the story forward. And I think that's when the magic happens, when they are moving the story forward because they're so interested and they have stakes that are on the table, like kids at home, or like they're gonna turn into a pumpkin, or whatever it might be, like, or the fate of Alderaan, or you know what I'm saying? Like they are going to be motivated to solve it. And I think that's where the magic is. They're motivated, and the DM has the narrative that they're kind of guiding, but it's not obvious. And if there's a point where the DM has to jump in, they send an NPC that kind of like leaks a tip that's going to lead them on to where they need to be without it feeling like they just got nudged so much as invited, if that makes sense, to pursue this new clue. There's definitely art to it, and I think it's much harder to do something like that in a one shot than it is in like a longer campaign like Avernus. So
that's true, and you're right. It is unsatisfying because I expect a black and white answer every time, Sarah, and you give me all this gray area. I don't know what to do with it. But anyway, great comments there, guys. Snake for work only. Let us know what you think. But a great question there and conversation that we had.
I have news here.
And the sound of Ralphie the News Goblin can mean only one thing. It's time for Potomac RPG News.
Ralphie!
All right, so I have an article here from Coleman Gailloreto over at ScreenRant.com titled "How a Tabletop RPG Game Master Can Avoid Railroading Their Players." A surprisingly on-topic news segment here. So, looking through the article, Gailloreto gives some pretty common advice here, but also a couple interesting points. Now, Sarah, what's your take on this article? Do you think Gailloreto has an article worthy of its title here?
I think it's definitely worth every DM kind of just taking a look through. It's a short article, just to kind of keep in mind the suggestions that he makes. I think they're handy. I don't know that there was anything that was really like mind-blowingly new or clever. Just some more guided ways in which to make sure your world is flexible enough, but you can still keep people on task. And obviously the biggest tip, and we say this all the time in our podcast, is to have a session 0 and find out what the players are looking for. Because like if, for example, Adam, if you want something a little bit more structured, that is really, really good to know as a DM. And also to take into consideration what Steve may want, and make sure that there's like maybe a marriage of the both, and that it can be maybe a little bit more open world, and then at other points more driven, or to make sure that your character always is reminded of their objective. But yeah, have that session 0 conversation. He does bring up one of the one of the epic problems, which is like people learn about something that's out there in the world and they get curious and they want to explore it, but then they can't explore it because it wasn't really mapped out. He said leave blank spaces so that you can either introduce your own stuff or also leave room for people who do want to pursue that. And this also brings to mind the podcast that we were talking about where the players wanted to learn how to act, like to do a troop. Do you remember that? Where and the DM wasn't prepared for that. And that's a classic. Like the DM just like spent all his time creating a whole other narrative, and bless her heart. And the players were really, really excited about the opportunity to have to learn some drama and go up on stage, and they really wanted to pursue this, and she just wasn't prepared for it. That would be an example of, maybe there's a blank area there that, she could have filled in and been okay with. That's the other thing. You have to be able to be okay with taking time when you're having trouble improvising, and you need to as a DM. So I thought that was a good tip as well. Just kind of slow the RP down a bit. Maybe let them kind of stew on some things or figure something out and put them on a little bit of a task while you figure out other things. But yeah, I think the article is definitely worth just looking at it. It'll give you some tools in your toolbox that you might need as a DM.
Absolutely. Well, how about you, Steve? Looking through this, you've been DMing Avernus for over a year now. Anything in this that you're like, didn't think of that, or anything along those lines?
I think I've generally thought about these things. I'm fortunate in the fact that the campaign has just sort of boxed you guys in through the scenario that I haven't had to worry as much about you going, what's that on the map? Let me go there. But yeah. I do think that, two things, sort of slowing the story down if you need time to improvise. Sometimes just slowing the story down anyways is a good idea. I mean, just because you have plot beats and they're already figured out doesn't mean you need to rush from plot beat to plot beat to plot beat. Sometimes it's nice to like give people a chance to breathe and absorb what's just happened, and figure out, what their characters think, feel, and how they want to respond to that before you dive right into the next big plot point. But I really like this notion of creating a world map with blank spaces. And I think this is especially important for people who are playing games that are, modules that come with a map already, or just playing like in, say, like Faerun, right? There's a very detailed map that all of our games in the Forgotten Realms have used that shows like where absolutely everything is. And that can be really, that can be hard because you feel like, you need to have this fidelity to the atlas of some world that there's not even all that much material for, unless you go back and buy old modules or old books from like Drive Through RPG or something like that. But also it feels like you're not able to like make it your own. And I think, even with maps like that, like DMs should definitely feel the, ability to insert stuff into those types of maps, and don't let that sort of constrain your creativity. If you want to have some sort of interesting crypt in the middle of the deep forest that, isn't shown on the map or at all sort of hinted there, you should do it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring that up. I think that Tom ran into that in the Monday group. This was before I joined that group, but I think there was a desire to basically jump off the main plot line and go visit Waterdeep because, it's Forgotten Realms, Sword Coast. You know where Waterdeep is in relation to you, and let's go there. Well, for a DM, like, how do you prepare for something? Waterdeep is huge. Like, how do you even prepare for something like that? So I definitely like that idea of the blank spaces. My favorite is the create multiple quests that intersect with player choices, and I think this is one way you can get around the whole railroad for a plot driven campaign, is that instead of where the main plot has to go, but giving your players options out of a few. So instead of just saying, well, where do you want to go, and the world's your oyster, the main plot line, but there's other kind of points of interest that are noted, and it kind of gives that illusion that it's a bit more open world without them getting into an area where you have nothing for. So perhaps it's like, oh, well, you're aware of this tip from at this location that you can go to, or you can go to this location, or you talk to this person and he said to go to here. Which one of those three would you like to go to? Well, that feels a little less railroady because you have your pick of three, and the order that you do them, or any that you don't do, might have effects down the line. So these little side quests and tangents that you can go on can kind of mix things up and keep it from feeling like a railroad. I don't know how well that works. I know in that campaign I did, that's exactly what I did, where I said, all right, guys, you have like these three main areas that you've been told about, which one you want to go to, and who knows what's going to happen when you get there. And by wasting time going to this one, did that affect the story in the other two? So the multiple quests are good, especially since then, if they don't hit something that you were expecting them to, you have that quest set up. There's a way to insert that later on down the road without it feeling like a railroad. So
absolutely.
Yeah,
and that, by the way,
article.
That was a great way to have some choice in a really sort of limited run game where we knew we had to go in sort of a certain direction. I think that's actually a very good example of how to balance the freedom of choice and exploration and what do you guys want to do, while still keeping us sort of somewhat constrained on a plot that we can resolve in a sort of the number of sessions more or less you were expecting to spend the time DMing a game.
No, well, I appreciate that. I'm glad it worked because I wasn't sure if it would. But no, it's definitely an option. And the article itself, like you guys said, it's nothing mind breaking or anything, but they are good points to keep in mind. And we'll throw the link up in the show notes so you can take a look at it if you want. But we're going to step out for a moment, but stay tuned. We'll be right back after the break.
As any tabletop role player would know, coffee is an essential commodity for those 4-hour sessions we all go through. And a great place to get that coffee is foundfamiliar.com. Found Familiar is a couple of people with a passion for coffee creation and D&D, and they've teamed up with favorite artists from all around the world to bring specialty grade coffee that celebrates the creativity sparked by Dungeons & Dragons and other TTRPGs. Use the coupon code Potomac RPG, all one word, at checkout for 10% discount on your purchase. That's at foundfamiliar.com. And with that, let's get back to the show.
How about another question? This post comes from Reddit user Nosuma666, who asks, how to progress a story without railroading my players. Hey everyone, I have a question about story writing that I struggled to answer myself. A little background first. I have only played D&D as a GM before. This is my second campaign, and I've only run homebrew adventures as I like improvising and creating my own stories and worlds. Now to my problem. I have already made a world in which my campaign takes place and written lore for the different places my PCs can visit. I also know how I want the campaign to progress and have a rough idea of what role my players should have in my world. And now my big question. How do I nudge them in the direction of the plot without erecting a giant sign that just has the word story written on it? Please be gentle on my grammar, not my first language, blah, blah, blah. So how do I guide my players toward the actual plot? So, Steve, this is a pretty common question here. DM doesn't want to railroad, but wants to keep their players on the plot. What do you do here?
Well, I think it's an easy solution, I think, and simple enough, is that if you know who your characters are to some extent, and they have any sort of backstory, motivations, so on and so forth. I mean, you have to take whatever your plot is going to be, and you have to tie those items into it somehow. It's really just about, I mean, you generally just need to like guide the players kind of in that direction, and they'll start following the flow of the river, right? So, if you've got someone who has, I don't know, they've got a revenge story in their background, they want vengeance against someone who killed their lover. Well, take that NPC who did the murder, whether they know who they are or there's an indication of who they could have been or whatever, and you fold them into whatever the seeds of the plot are, or the first plot arc or something, to sort of draw that player in. And it's not terribly hard. I mean, players, I think if you're coming to a D&D game, like I don't sit down at a D&D game personally and think like, okay, so the DM told me we start in this village and my character is this. Now, what do I want to do with this session? Because I know I've got 5 other people who all have things that they want to do. We can't all possibly just like go and do whatever we want. So I'm looking for the plot hook. And so if you just dangle something that has anything to do with my story, the things that I've already told you that I care about, that's like, all right, boom, I know. Okay, that's the thing I want to pay attention to. I'm going to start scratching at that. Even if it's not the core thing or whatever, I'm going to start scratching at it. And then you can just use that to like a current just to pull me right into the plot.
Yeah, and that kind of brings up the point of session 0 even more, where it's like the DM has to know who and what that character is in their background in order to build those little plot hooks to dangle. And the so many groups, they come in session 1 and the DM doesn't really know what that character is about, or how do you that's when you get the you all meet in a tavern and this happens. Well, there's still nothing linking everyone together. As soon as you get those links in place early on, like Steve said, you'll follow that path, down the river. Yeah, Sarah, how about you? A great thing that you did in your one shot was, we were all clerics. It was an all cleric adventure, and we were all called to this town to investigate something, basically. So right there, we all have the hook. We all have, we're clerics, so we obviously want, to follow whatever our path, chosen path is, and you put us in that location. Like, I think you did really well on that. How do you go about inserting that plot for us to follow?
Well, thank you for that. Because I did have some concerns about railroading everyone because it was such a short campaign, but I really wanted to play up the fact that you guys were clerics, that there's something completely special about that class, because I love that class, and that you bring to the table something unique when it comes to your faith, and I really wanted to try and appeal to that faith, to the goodness that a lot of the characters had. I don't think that every character there was leaned towards completely good, but it was very cool to try and appeal that. But I wanted to make it as personal as possible for you to explore your faith in your unique way and your interpretation of, for example, the value of a life based on that faith and that perspective. I absolutely agree with Steve that the appealing to the character's motivation for being there is essential, because they aren't being pulled along. They're going to run towards the hook. And if you can find what it is that they want, what is their main objective, and then also what happens if they don't reach it. I think that's always a really, really good question. Like, for example, if the guy wants to be king, that's great. Maybe he can take 50 years to do it, or 10 or whatever. But what happens if he doesn't become king? Does his sister get there first and she's completely insane? Okay, so now we have a reason to make him a king faster. Stuff like that, where the absence of them achieving what they want has consequences. And that's kind of like a point of no return then, right? So they have to achieve this objective, whatever it is, or something really, really bad is going to happen. And if you can make it personal, that's great. Other than just like the villagers will all die, because we've played enough that's pretty much a given.
Well, the one interesting thing that you did, Steve, in Avernus was with our session 0, there was basically partnering up. You had me and Tom, our 2 characters kind of were together. Sarah, you, Matt, and
Nick.
Ben.
Nick.
Was it Ben?
Nick. Nope,
Nick,
Nick's
yeah.
character.
You, Matt, and Nick were together as almost a group, and then you had Ben and kind of off on his own with Anthony. But it, like, by linking people together, it makes it a little bit easier to get them down that main plot line, because you're not trying to hold together all these different threads and bind them into one, because the process has already started. And I thought that was a genius way to do it, not only story-wise, because you had some tangents that you could go off of to build up that role play, but also less work to do to keep us together.
Yeah. I mean, what was really cool about that is that it was very organic, right? I certainly wanted you guys to find some ways to create some backstory that I could use to sort of pull on. But a lot of that came from just sitting everyone down and saying, instead of in a vacuum, hey, everybody make characters and then show up for next week, we're starting a new campaign. We had the advantage of, and I think it's the only time we've done this, I took a session and I said, look, I'm not going to run a game this session. I want to get together, hang out with all my friends. And I don't know if you remember, but I had like the tavern lighting going and
you
music
had candles
and
going,
maps spread out with like things weighing it down and all this kind of cool stuff. And I was like, I want you guys just to add all the books out. I was like, we're just going to create characters tonight. And then you guys that's the only game we've had where you guys rolled stats, which I miss. I think that's really fun, because it really did tend towards you guys being a bit overpowered, to be honest. Everyone, for the most part, rolled really well. I got to introduce sort of a thematic mechanic to the game where I was giving people the option of I basically gave folks, because you didn't see your stats until I gave them to you after I was done with everyone, the opportunity to take their lowest stat and swap it with someone else's second highest stat. Mm-hmm. So if they had a bad set of rolls, they could go, yeah, okay, I'll take I don't know what the best is going to be from, but I'll take it from Sarah. And now Sarah's stuck with my bad roll and I got her second best roll, which is so just fits into that devilish Avernus-y. And I think, and I didn't tell anybody how many people said yes versus how many people said no or anything like that.
Yeah,
and so it created this. Yeah, it created, and I'll never tell. And it created this whole environment where you guys were getting into thinking about the type of game I'm trying to play. You're thinking about characters, but you didn't come in with I'm playing a human rogue. He's got, the leadership feat, and this is his background.
Yeah,
you guys started building together.
On the fly. Yeah,
right. And building together, it's that would be fun. Why not? Hey, well, I'm thinking about my character. I'm thinking about playing this character that does this, and that sort of connects with each other. So we should, work out the story together. I really wish we would do that for any long-term game that we play. Anything that's going to be story heavy, because I think it's great. And also, once in a blue moon, it's nice to then we can sit there and do all that nerding out about mechanics and interesting ideas, this and that. Yeah, stuff that we wouldn't normally be able to do because we're sitting down to play a session. Yeah. That was like a magical moment. I really enjoyed that, and I look forward to doing it again someday.
Yeah, that was really good. That was really good. Well, yeah, hopefully Nosuma 666, hopefully that helps out a little bit. Best of luck in your second campaign. Let us know how it's going. We want to hear how this world is progressing and how your players are reacting to it. So there are thousands of fantastic, weird, and downright horrible stories out there, and some are so ridiculous that you have to question their accuracy. So let's see if you two can figure out the one that doesn't belong in our segment, Say It Ain't So. Welcome to Say It Ain't So, where we see if our two guests can spot the one that doesn't belong. So here's how it'll work. We'll each read an RPG horror story about railroading. 2 will be true, 1 will be false. It's your job to figure out which one is the made-up one. Pretty simple, right? You two ready?
Oh, yeah. I love this one.
All right. Let's get into it. So I've given you guys each a story to read. I have one as well. We're going to go through these 3 and then try to figure out which one is made up. So I have the first story. It's called Negative XP. What are the thoughts on a negative XP session? Our group tends to do a lot of non-combat encounters. We still do combat and like big fights, but we have just tended to have a lot of non-combat sessions lately. In one of the last ones, the party chose the absolute wrong decision at every turn. They disregarded allies, abandoned innocents, and overall just failed at the session. The players were not being problematic, and in fact, they were doing what they reasoned was right. At the end of the night, I gave them negative 750 XP. Nothing too terrible, just a hint that things story-wise went off kilter. But now I wonder if it was unneeded and seemed too punitive. So,
Oh my god.
negative XP. All right. So, Steve, I believe you're up next. Go ahead.
Railroading equipment choices. I was playing a fighter in a party with a bard, sorcerer, and ranger. I built my character around using a halberd with combat maneuvers and the polearm feat. Just to spice things up, since not every armored boy needs to be a sword user. The DM decided to give the party special anime magic weapons with super OP buffs with extra damage and crowd control effects. Ranger gets a bow that only misses on nat 1s. Sorcerer gets a staff that auto upcasts spells. Bard gets an instrument that doubles healing. I get a +3 sword with 3d8 base damage. I decided to keep using my normal halberd anyways. We fought monsters way above our normal level, and the DM was really trying to push me to use the sword. No thanks, I'm good. Someone else can use it if they want, or we can sell it when we get back to town. Eventually, the sword binds to me despite never having interacted with it myself. Also, there's a minor curse where any other weapon I try to wield crumbles into dust. At least the polearm build was kind of interesting for one encounter, I guess.
So that
Wow.
was railroading equipment choices. All right, Sarah, third story.
Mine is called Portals. This happened to an old group I was in. Only lasted a few sessions, but it was horrible. We started off in the tavern, as most do. But quickly after player introductions, a portal opened up and sucked all of us through. No warning, no nothing. We ended up in a dungeon with a bunch of monsters. Okay, that's fine, I guess. Weird that only us were sucked through and no one else from the tavern. We fought off the monsters and eventually reached the boss. The second we kill him, though, another portal opened up and swallowed us again. We plopped down in another dungeon. Fight through a bunch of monsters and kill the boss. You guessed it, another portal opens up. No story at all. No choice to do anything other than fight. No time to get to know each other or figure out why we were there. Just portal after portal. This went on for 3 sessions before I finally said, I'm done.
All right, so that was Portal. So let's turn to you first, Steve. So you got negative XP, railroading equipment choices, and portals. Which one of those 3 do you think was made up?
That's a tough choice. I mean, this railroading equipment choices, right? You have to make these up if you're making them up, and I just don't know if I hear in your inner voice making up an anime related story. So I feel like this one might be true. And it sounds like, I mean, my gosh, you build a character to be a halberd using crowd controller, and then a DM who's got this great idea about these super overpowered weapons just gives you like the wrong thing and forces you to use it. That totally seems believable to me. The portal stuff, that just sounds like a really easy and convenient way to get you to go from, one place to the next. But that makes me think, well, is number 1 the fake story, negative XP? But I don't know why that makes me feel like maybe someone did actually try to do this. So I'm going to go with number 3, the portals is the made up story.
All right. So you're going with portals. Sarah, what do you think out of those three?
I also think it's number 3. I'm gonna be surprised if it isn't, but I usually try to read you, Adam, when I'm reading these, rather than whether or not they're real. I'm trying to think of what would Adam have written. So I feel like I also feel like most people, when they sit down to role play, do crave some role play more than just the mechanical fighting. And so this feels a little bit more like, I don't know, out there for me. So
All right. Well, you guys know me well. Portals was the fake story. The first 2 negative XP and railroading equipment choices were completely
terrible,
true stories. Yeah. So you won, but are anyone winners here? Because like
seriously,
those other 2 stories really happened. Negative XP. I mean, that's
negative,
like,
oh, could you imagine?
Just not getting any experience if you're in an experience-driven game for a whole session of play feels like punishment enough. I mean, but negative XP, that just seems like you don't be as a DM need to go like, yeah, you guys are fucking idiots. And here's how you know I just docked you XP. I don't know. Yeah. Seems a bit far.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, hey, well done, guys.
And those anime weapons. Whew.
So, see, I was hoping that you glom onto that because we were talking a little bit about anime last night. I was like, oh, they're going to think I wrote this one because it's talking about anime. But I was wrong.
Because it said things like boy, like BOI, and had grammatical errors that I fixed while I was reading. What you really need to do is you're going to have to start. We're getting wise to your ways. You're going to have to start really upping your game in terms of writing these bad. Like do it in like green text, like. Be me, exactly. A druid.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you need to stop using mostly complete sentences that are properly sentence capped and everything.
That's my tell. All right. Well, hey, let's get into the last post of the week. This one comes from Reddit user Megan James TS, who asks, improv for control freaks. I came to this sub looking for advice on how to prepare for my campaign, and I am seeing a lot of people suggesting to kind of sketch out the bare bones of the adventure, and it provides the rest. Or maybe have NPCs and encounters lined up, but let them happen wherever and whenever. I'm looking at the preparation I did for part 1 of the Horde of the Dragon Queen module, and I feel like I went way overboard. I guess I am kind of a control freak, and the idea of a situation where players do something totally unexpected gives me some anxiety. But I don't want my players to feel railroaded either. I can see why a more loose and open game would be more fun, but I'm just worried that my players won't know what to do or won't be able to think of anything to do, and we will all just be sitting there twiddling our thumbs. Or I'm worried they will think of something cool to do, and I won't have anything like that prepared. So, Sarah, I think this is a common fear among DMs. What's your advice to bring down some of the anxiety that Megan is feeling?
Well, I think the first thing I'm going to point out is that the players are always going to do something unexpected, no matter how much planning you've done. Every time, yeah. In fact, it's just kind of, I don't know, par for the course that they'll go off the rails at some point. So I think being comfortable, try to be comfortable, or at least expose yourself to the different ways in which someone might go off the rails, and just kind of maybe practice, like, if this were to happen, I would do that just to get more comfortable with that improvisation, because I think the only way to be comfortable with improv is to do it. The other thing I would also say is that it sounds like you're incredibly detail oriented, which is a special power I wish I had more of. And I think that probably the nuances and the way you could probably articulate certain things would be probably beautiful when it plays out, because of the details that you've placed on things. But I do think you actually will have more power if you allow a little bit of flexibility, in the sense that you have some of these details, but they're not so finite and concrete that you can't stray from them. Because that, to me, is going to produce more anxiety when people get there if they don't do quite what you want them to do, than if you had some wiggle room for ways things might go. And it could be just like thinking of 3 different ways, that you might handle something. This is really tough, because I think detailed people tend to be really, really, you can tell I have a lot of envy, very powerful when it comes to especially things like storytelling, or recognizing like the little logic holes in like a thriller, or, you know, stuff like that. And I love being around them, and I love watching them work. But yeah, you don't give yourself a coronary over, you know, trying to get people to stay the course, because it's never going to happen. You're praying for the perfect group, and that doesn't exist. So.
Well, Steve, how about you? I mean, as a, I don't know if you fall into the detail oriented or not, but you know, with this type of person, like, how do they get through that anxiety of their players not reacting the way that they expected?
You know, I think this is one of those things that maybe gets addressed in a good session zero type conversation. Because, you know, I'm reading this and hearing about all the anxiety, and it's like, are you playing this game with like some friends, or is this like a job interview? You know, like all these things can happen, right? You can be as prepared as you want, and they can still think of something new. They can think of anything that is possible to think of. You cannot possibly prepare for anything that they can think of doing. And sometimes players don't have any ideas because someone was staring at their phone. One other person was distracted by a spouse talking at them because they're playing online. And, you know, one person's passive, and the person who's always driving the action doesn't feel like driving the action for some reason. The hook hasn't caught him. So you can be in that position no matter what, no matter how hard you prepare, no matter what you do. This is too much anxiety for D&D. This is supposed to be a game you're playing with friends and having fun. I mean, if you're a professional paid DM or something like that, okay, I can see, you know, getting a little more anxiety. But I think it's just take a deep breath, have a conversation with players to get, you know, a sense of what they're interested in. Let them know the type of game that you're trying to run, and then if things kind of blow up in the moment, hey, you know, step back and say, hey guys, I just need a second. I didn't necessarily anticipate all of that. Give me a second to just look over my notes and you know, whip something together. And then just, you know, you've got a monster manual, you've got these things. Just, you know, if you have to, just create a random person. They don't have to be the most interesting and the most deep NPC. Most of your deep NPCs, the players are never really going to catch all that depth and meaning that you put into them. I have things in my plot that I've beaten you guys over the head with, and nobody, I mean, I finally had a conversation with Tom where I explained something to him, and he was like, oh my God, that's the most blindingly obvious thing, but I never would have thought about it until you laid it out that way. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm getting that vibe that no one is really picking this up, and that's okay. It just is what it is. You know, so, you know, all this preparation, all that, you know, it's covering up this anxiety of they're not going to like what I'm preparing for them. They're not going to like me as a DM. They're not going to be having fun. Look, you're taking your time and preparing a game for these folks. They're presumably your friends, or they're randos from online or what have you. And if they don't like it, then you'll find more randos. But if they're your friends, you know, I'm sure if they're good friends, they're going to be understanding and willing to work with you and help you grow as a DM. But just, I couldn't imagine having to deal with that level of anxiety. I definitely think that's a perspective shift that would be helpful, because there's just no way you can't prepare for everything.
Yeah.
And,
well, I mean,
and it should be fun to play, not.
Yeah. I would actually look at your preparation in terms of going overboard. It sounds like they have a super good understanding of what's in this game, not just like the lineup of, you know, choices to make, but the lore, the everything. Like it sounds like the prep is, you know, Megan says, went way overboard. Well, you know, use that to your advantage. You know this world, you know everything that's happening, you know what's happening when and what effect that it's going to have. Well, use that to your benefit, so when a player makes a choice, you can logically figure out what the consequences of that choice are within the story that you have and adjust it accordingly. So just because a player makes a choice that you weren't expecting, because of your preparation, it should allow you to really make some things interesting, because you already know what effect that's going to have on the rest of your story. So, you know, I would gain some confidence in the fact that you prepared so much in that you're ready to react to anything that your players do. It shouldn't be anxiety. It should be confidence, because you got this. You got this, Megan. And yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit, and would love to hear how your campaign is going, Megan. Let us know. But that is going to do it for us this week. Remember, if you want to send in your questions or anything you find on the internet, you can send them to questions@PotomacRPG.com. Check out our store for merch at teespring.com/stores/PotomacRPG. If you'd like to support the Potomac RPG podcast, you can find us on coffee.com/PotomacRPG. And lastly, you can follow us at Potomac RPG on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for being on today, Sarah and Steve. Thank you to the rest of the Potomac RPG crew, and of course, all of our wonderful listeners out there. So, for the Potomac RPG podcast, I'm Adam.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Steve.
Till next time, keep those dice rolling, keep those stories coming, and
never stop playing.
Choo choo! I'm not getting on your railroad. Steve, what a great guy. Did you know about this, Steve? He's pretty great.